of women, in fact, the Center on Wrongful Convictions is launching a new program called the Women's Defense Initiative. And I'm going to give you some things to think about and some general information about women and wrongful convictions and exonerations. And then I'm going to turn the discussion over to the Women's Defense Initiative Director and Lawrence alum, Andrea Lewis Hartung, for a more substantive discussion of some of the women's cases and the legal and societal issues they present. But to start, I'm going to ask the audience to consider the following scenarios and simply answer for yourself the simple yes or no questions posed on each slide. And I'd ask you to keep these scenarios in mind as we discuss women and women's contact with the criminal justice system. So first, I'd like you to think about, you're a single mom with a 4- and 5-year-old child at home, and today is laundry day. The laundromat's just across the street from your apartment. You've been doing laundry all day. Your boyfriend is over, he's napping in your apartment, and the kids are playing in their room. Do you get the laundry from across the street? You're at home with your 24-month-old child who falls off the couch and hits his head. He cries for a bit and has a bruise on his head, but he seems okay. Do you call the doctor? Your 3-year-old child falls off a piece of furniture and hits his head while neither you or your partner are in the room. And you hear the fall and you rush to the child who's hurt. You take him to the hospital. Do you think you'll be charged with a crime? I'd ask you to keep those simple binary decisions in mind while we discuss wrongful convictions and exonerations and women's involvement in this system more generally. So since 1999, the CWC has worked to free over 40 wrongfully convicted people and help to free many more. Since 1989, 2,736 individual exonerations have happened in the United States. 91% of them have been men. Only 239 of them have been women, just 9%. And most of those exonerations of women have happened in just the last 10 years. So what's an exoneration? An exoneration is an official act declaring a defendant not guilty of a crime for which he or she had previously been convicted. And what are the sources of exoneration? There are pardons from the executive branch of the government, be it state or federal. There are convictions that are vacated after new evidence of innocence is revealed, and acquittals after retrials. There's also the posthumous acknowledgement of actual innocence. I would note the National Registry of Exonerations, which is a website that any of us can peruse for detailed information about cases of wrongfully convicted and exonerated individuals. The National Registry records actual innocence as distinguished from legal innocence. Some convictions are wrongful, and some of those people might even be innocent, but they do not meet the registry definition of exoneration. And this is the case with one of those CWC's former clients who is a woman. And I think we would posit that this is the case for many women. This is the paltry number of women exonerees in light of the fact that we know the fastest growing population of incarcerated people in the United States are women. And in fact, until recently, the fastest growing population of women in being incarcerated were Black women. So clearly, the women's exoneration numbers are low. Information on women from the Prison Policy Initiative states that for the last several decades, women's incarceration rates have been growing at twice the pace of men's incarceration. Over the last 40 years, women's incarceration has increased 834%. Meanwhile, the rate of men's incarceration has been decreasing. On their face, these stats indicate that something is very wrong with this system. We do not believe that a system that gets it wrong so often is getting it right for women. Women are clearly falling through the cracks, and women are going to not be exonerated. That should be because of it. So how do we get wrongfully convicted? What are the factors for becoming wrongfully convicted? What makes women different? It appears kind of from the beginning of the innocence movement, dating back to the late 80s, early 90s, women were at a disadvantage. The Innocence Project, which was founded in New York in the early 90s, started and only took cases with potential exculpatory DNA evidence. And many innocence projects and individuals working in post-conviction followed suit and limited the cases they took to only include cases where there would be possible DNA testing as exculpatory evidence. Now, the CWC was founded in 1999, and it was the first law clinic, innocence clinic, in a law school that took post-conviction cases that went beyond DNA testing, that would take a case of a false confession or an erroneous eyewitness ID, perjury or false accusation, official misconduct, or false or misleading forensic evidence beyond DNA. The leading contributing factors for wrongful conviction are official misconduct, which is present in over 50% of exonerations, and perjury and false accusation, which is present in nearly 60% of all exonerations. This is very significant. DNA is actually only really dispositive in less than a third of all exonerations. And it's significant for women because DNA testing is rarely helpful or dispositive in their innocence cases. In the 30 years since the innocent movement was established, many of us that are aware of innocent people being wrongfully convicted have been influenced by the idea that DNA evidence is the gold standard in proving innocence. And those of us that are aware of innocent people being in prison likely carry an image of who the wrongfully convicted person is and how they can be exonerated. Many think it's likely a man of color, poor, who can be exonerated by DNA testing or another forensic science. And there are myriad problems with this thinking. Anyone can be wrongfully convicted. We get it wrong in a lot of cases where there is DNA evidence. And we certainly are getting it wrong in a lot of cases where no such evidence is available. But perhaps the biggest hurdle for women in wrongful conviction starts with the simple fact of being a woman. What do we expect of women as people, as mothers, as caregivers, and as family members? And what do we hold them responsible for? When the CWC first engaged in women's issues, we started a project called the Women's Project to study women and wrongful conviction. We've long been aware that women were underrepresented in the wrongful conviction space and that they face unique issues that their male counterparts do not. The women exonerees were a very small group in an enormous group of men, and they were marked by very real differences in their cases compared to their male counterparts. The majority of the women exonerees were white women, even though we knew for many years the largest growing population of incarcerated women were Black women. Most were convicted of crimes that involved an alleged victim that was known to them. And the majority were also convicted of crimes that did in fact not happen. No crime cases that Andrea will discuss in detail shortly. At the time the CWC started to look at these issues, the CWC's own clients, women clients, were single mothers charged with crimes of murdering their children. All of the women had made statements, not confessions necessarily, but statements that the police and prosecutors saw as incriminating. Their status as a woman or a mother was brought up during investigation, trial, or at sentencing. And they were more likely to be held responsible for the conduct of someone else. The incidents they were being charged with were accidents. And these issues all were adding up to no clear path to exoneration. And until quite recently, very few women were represented because their cases were just too daunting and resource heavy, requiring medical and forensic experts to explain accidents and underlying health conditions. So in sum, they needed different kinds of help to seek different kinds of relief because the women's cases did not fit neatly into the traditional post-conviction actual innocence litigation. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Andrea Lewis Hartung to get into the details of those non-traditional paths.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I will talk a bit about what the Center on Wrongful Convictions has seen as far as women's cases in the past, and also what we would like to address moving forward that hasn't necessarily been sufficiently addressed by the innocence movement to date. But just to give you a brief bit of background, I actually came in to work at the Center on Wrongful Convictions with that initial women's project. And so I spent a lot of time studying these different issues and also just reading letters of people who wrote to us and asked for help, and specifically women who had written to us and asked for help. And so I, in addition to seeing those factors that lead to wrongful conviction that Sara was talking about, started seeing some additional things creeping into letters, especially domestic violence issues, especially maybe developmental disability issues, especially issues having to do with poverty and race that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And as Sara mentioned, our system just really isn't set up to deal with how those problems intersect with each other when it comes to a crime or a perceived crime. And so for that reason, moving forward, we wanted to use this Women's Defense Initiative to expand our representation, and also ultimately to reclaim this term wrongful conviction and to work with women who we believe were wronged in some way, either by being convicted of crimes that they did not commit, or by being convicted of crimes that shouldn't have been crimes, or by having been over-sentenced. And so with that, I'll start with where we've come from to date. So Sara mentioned there have been 239 women's exonerations since 1989. That's out of over 2,700 exonerations to date. And you can see here sort of the trajectory of women's exoneration cases over the last few decades. So in the first 10 years or so of the National Registry of Exonerations, they marked 46 women's exoneration cases. Between 2000 and 2009, there were 56, so there was a small improvement in things. And then between 2010 and 2020, we saw a large uptick with 137 women being exonerated. And that was more than the previous 21 years of the National Registry combined. So again, an improvement, we acknowledge that, but still we're looking at 239 women who have been exonerated out of 2,700 to date. Now, the Center on Wrongful Convictions, as Sara mentioned, has represented several of these women. We've represented 5 exonerated women to date. And we've thought a lot about why the numbers look the way they look and why this sharp uptick happened. And I think one possible explanation is just that the kinds of cases for which women have been wrongfully convicted are receiving more attention. They're being seen as problematic now. DNA, as you've heard, is really important to exonerating people in the early days of the innocence movement. But in the last, I'd say 10 years or maybe a little more, we've been moving away from DNA exonerations, in part because DNA testing happens if there's a murder, if there's a crime in which DNA evidence can be helpful, that testing happens on the front end, not on the back end. And so now the legal system is recognizing that there are other types of evidence can show that someone didn't commit a crime for which they were convicted. And then I mentioned the types of cases for which women are typically wrongfully convicted. One of the top crime types is murder, much like that of men. The difference being that women are more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murdering someone they know, and more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murdering or harming someone in their care. Whereas for men, they're more likely to be convicted of crimes against strangers. Women also are likely to be wrongfully convicted of child abuse or child sex abuse. And for Black women and other women of color in particular, drug possession or sale is a common category of wrongful conviction cases. And so when you hear those types, you can see why DNA wouldn't necessarily be helpful for an exoneration. But women are still underrepresented, and I suspect that'll be true for some time. So I'll talk a little about the factors that we've seen at play so far and what we expect to see moving forward. So this is Tina Jimerson. Some people on the call may have seen this photo, and she's the most recent Women Center on Wrongful Convictions exoneree. And she is one of a very small number of women who were exonerated last year in 2020. She was convicted in 1990 of participating in a murder that happened in a small town in Arkansas in 1988. And she allegedly was the getaway driver with 3 other men who were also charged and convicted with murder. They were all given life sentences. Tina ultimately was released in 2018 after she received relief from federal courts. Our legal team had discovered that the police had used a confidential informant in her case, but did not reveal that fact. And the confidential informant spoke to a co-defendant of Tina's who was extremely developmentally delayed, and that person confessed and implicated the others in the case. And so she ultimately was released after that information came out. And also one of her co-defendants ultimately confessed that he alone committed the crime and that no one else was involved. But a few things stuck out about her case apart from the legal procedures. And one of them was that Tina was a victim of sexual violence. And she was discarded. Her word was discarded. She made an allegation as a Black woman against a white man. No one ever investigated. Nobody ever, did any interviews or checked to see, what might have happened. The police decided she must have been lying. And in fact, in court, accused her of being a prostitute. I mean, Tina wasn't a prostitute, and regardless of, her job, she was reporting a sexual assault. And instead of being taken seriously, she ended up being investigated in this case. Another thing that stuck out to me was that Tina encountered overt racism in this case, like racial epithets were used throughout. Her co-defendants had the same problem. And so this really was a case in which, her gender and her race seemed to intersect and cause this sort of tunnel vision that led to her being convicted of something that she didn't do and spending decades of her life in prison. Now, Tina got out. She's one of the lucky ones who were released. She was just one of just 9 women in the United States who were exonerated last year. And by contrast, over 100 men were exonerated. But then that begs the question, what's happening? Why are there so few women being exonerated? And maybe more importantly, what can we do to make sure that women who are facing wrongful convictions or facing violations of their rights in the criminal legal system receive support and have the opportunity to re-enter society? So here's a list of common women's issues that we've seen over time after examining the cases of women who have been later released. I'll address each one in turn, and then I'll talk about how my project will work to address these issues. The first I've talked about, so this will be very brief, is the lack of helpful DNA evidence. To give some numbers, DNA played a role in a little over 19% of all exonerations to date. DNA evidence was available in the exonerations of the cases of 11 women. But in only 4 women's cases was DNA the thing that exonerated a woman. Right? And without physical evidence, it's very difficult to prove innocence with certainty. And we as people certainly want to make sure that people who are a danger to society are not out and causing harm to people, but we also want to make sure that people are not being kept in prison who are not harmful and who have not done anything wrong. However, again, without DNA, without other physical evidence, in several states, remedies in court are limited. They're either limited to DNA testing or other scientific testing, or they are just extremely narrow if you don't have that type of evidence. Tina Jemerson's case is an example. The reason we were in federal court in the first place is because there was just no vehicle, or at least no viable vehicle in her state court to show up and say, hey, I've got this evidence that there was state misconduct. Oh, and by the way, this other guy confessed to the crime. Like there was nothing, no opportunity for her to have good chances of success going in a state court. And so we spent a lot of time in a federal court instead, just arguing over whether we could be there and arguing over whether she could hypothetically get relief. And again, we were lucky, but that was just an additional barrier to release that maybe wouldn't have been present had there been forensic evidence or had she been in a different state. Death of a loved one or child in their care. This is something we see very commonly with women's wrongful convictions. About 40% of women exonerees were convicted of harming or killing someone who was in their care, whether that's a child, their own child, or a child they were babysitting, or a spouse or someone else close to them in their care. In the Center on Wrongful Convictions, 3 exonerees who we've represented were convicted of killing their own children. We've represented 2 other women who were ultimately released from prison, but have no opportunity for formal exoneration. They were also convicted of killing their own children. Most of the women we have represented who have later been released knew the victims or the alleged victims in their case. By contrast, for men, over half of wrongful conviction homicide convictions involve strangers. And so that adds a different level of complication to investigating a case where a woman claims she's been wrongfully convicted, and also just adds a different level of interacting with clients and with the system on a human level, because you've got a death that has happened and the person who has died is known to the person who is the suspect in the case. No crime cases. Sara mentioned that most women exonerees were convicted in cases where no crime occurred. Do you all find that shocking? because I like every time I see that number, every time I say that number, I'm pretty taken aback and floored by the fact that most of the women who have been exonerated weren't convicted in cases where they got the wrong person. They were convicted in cases where there was nothing unlawful that happened. Those cases, again, are hard. They're hard to overturn because you can't point to another suspect, and anyone who does this kind of work can say, it's really helpful if you can say you have the wrong person. Oh, and it was that person, not my person. That was certainly helpful in Tina Jemerson's case. There's no DNA, there's no fingerprints, there's no physical evidence, there's nothing to test necessarily to show that the woman didn't do it. And of course, accidents are not crimes, and our system is essentially set up to, if the police are called and they open an investigation, there's a high likelihood that they're investigating a crime and not necessarily in the mind frame to spend a lot of time saying, maybe this isn't a crime, maybe it was an accident. And we have seen many instances of tunnel vision where once it is determined, and I'm not saying it's always determined, sometimes, you know, accidents happen and the system gets that right. But in many cases, we see that it has been determined that it's a crime, and then someone goes in search of evidence of the crime, right? And not in search of evidence that it wasn't. And then by contrast, about 30% of male exoneration cases were no crime cases. I wish that number were 0, but it's certainly far less than women. And to give some examples of kinds of cases I'm talking about, when I say no crimes, I'll talk about a couple of former clients of the Center on Wrongful Convictions. But you all saw some scenarios at the beginning of the presentation involving falls that were accidents. We've seen those result in wrongful convictions. We've also seen many women, and this is an even trickier case for exoneration and even release, where, you know, people have been accused of not getting their child help soon enough, even if everyone acknowledges that, you know, an accident happened or there's no abuse, or someone may be convicted of, you know, a crime that someone else committed because that person didn't protect the child. And we see for these types of cases, largely these theories, like you didn't get your child help soon enough, oh, that wasn't an accident, it was abuse. We see these theories used largely against female caregivers, against either mothers or women who are babysitters, etc. So that brings me to gender bias, which is something we see frequently in women's wrongful conviction cases. We see stereotypes used throughout trial when they have nothing to do with the case at hand. So in a few minutes, I'll talk to you about a client of ours who was accused of not being a good mom because she didn't, you know, she said, my house caught on fire, my child was inside, I tried to go get him. And they were like, well, you clearly didn't try hard enough, you must not have wanted him, right? And not trying hard enough to get him out certainly didn't mean she had murdered anyone, but it was used as evidence in her case. We see a lot of like not behaving in a ladylike manner or behaving inappropriately. You all may be very familiar with the Amanda Knox case. You've seen the media and seen how her personal life was put all over the TV when the question was, did she murder this person? We see heightened media attention for women accused of committing crimes, which our clients at least have to deal with when they come home and forever, because their stories are just out there. They can't start a new life and pretend nothing ever happened. So again, an example of gender bias, Christine Bunch. She was convicted of murder in connection with the 1995 death of her 3-year-old son, who died in a house fire. The state said she set the fire on purpose. And she was the one who said she had tried to save her son. She had injuries from trying to go back in the house. She had suffered from smoke inhalation, but, you know, she was told she didn't try hard enough. And she was charged with and convicted of murder and accused at trial of being a terrible mother. Christine also, I mentioned poverty sort of playing a role in what we see in our cases. She was living in a mobile home at the time. When she talks, she always tells everyone her case, she was exonerated ultimately based on advancements in fire science, but like she wasn't sophisticated. She didn't know about the criminal legal system. She was a single mom, and she really didn't have the resources to reach out and find experts or people who would have the specific expertise she needed for her to be acquitted of her crime. So instead, she was in prison until 2012, and eventually she was released based on advancements in fire science, in part based on advancements in fire science that showed the fire was accidental, so no one set the fire. This was a no crime case. But there was also evidence in the crime lab that they knew that some documents had been altered to suggest she had purposely set a fire when she had not. And so she had to face that. Now she's a fierce advocate for exoneree compensation. And she also works now on advocating for early release for women who have served lengthy prison sentences, because she says she's seen a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. She sees a lot of women in prison who have suffered from stereotypes and different things in their cases. Race disparities. When we talk about race in the criminal legal system, I'd say by and large, we're talking about Black men, and they certainly make up the large part of the criminal legal system, but this is an issue that affects women as well. So nearly 50% of exonerated people are Black, and Black people make up a little more than 13% of the population. And so those numbers are a bit skewed. In keeping with that, over half of male exonerees are Black, but there are more white women on the National Registry. About 57% of the women exonerees have in fact been white. Only about 29% of women exonerees are Black, even though Black women are incarcerated at a higher rate than white women. And so what that tells me isn't that, we're getting it, or the criminal legal system is correctly convicting Black women, but not white women. It's telling me that Black women are falling through the cracks. And that's a really big deal, because as you see here, Black defendants tend to spend longer in prison before exoneration. From a standpoint of women are far more likely to be primary caregivers, women in prison. And so you're affecting entire families here when a woman is wrongfully convicted. It's important for us to address these disparities. There are also race differences we see in crime types when we look at the National Registry. So if we look at white women, they are more likely to have been convicted of harming family members. Black women are more likely, and again, we see these stereotypes coming into play, to have been convicted of what we can traditionally consider street crimes, or things that men are more likely to be convicted of. And so for Black women, we've seen a lot of wrongful convictions in drug cases. For Black women, we've seen, and when I say Black women, I guess also women of color, Black and brown women, we've seen convictions of harming or killing strangers as opposed to people they know. And so two of my clients who have been exonerated and our women were both convicted of killing strangers, which if you look at the white women that we've represented at the Center on Wrongful Convictions, they were all convicted of killing their children. And so I find that to be an interesting dichotomy, particularly for the drug cases, because, as Sara mentioned, our projects are pretty limited in what we can take on. We're limited in capacity. For something like a drug case where a sentence won't be heavy, an innocence project won't necessarily take that case on, because they're focused on people who are still in prison and still in custody and can be released later. And meanwhile, again, we've got other people falling through the cracks. I'll talk about Nicole Harris, because she's a good example of how gender and race, another good example about how they can come together and lead to wrongful conviction. Nicole was the Laundry Day example. So she was convicted of murder in connection with the 2005 death of her 4-year-old son. He was strangled with the elastic band from a fitted sheet on his bed, except he strangled himself by accident. It was a tragic accident, and it was witnessed by Nicole's other son. Nonetheless, Nicole was pulled from the hospital immediately after her son's death, taken to the police station, and she was interrogated for 27 hours. She had been separated from her older son at that point and told she couldn't see him, essentially until she confessed. And again, remember, she's 27 hours at the police station, and her child just died. So eventually, she gave a confession that didn't quite match the evidence, but seemed good enough for the police. So why would the police have pushed her to confess? We suspect a lot of this had to do with this gender bias and race bias. Like, she was his mom. She was supposed to protect him, right? She's an unmarried mother, and, that's a strike against her. As far as race bias, during the interrogation, she acknowledged that she had run across the street to the laundromat to get her laundry and her kids were inside. She, didn't think that was abnormal. The police said, no, you're a bad mom. She also acknowledged she spanked her children on occasion, which, culturally for her, again, wasn't anything that suggested she had murdered her child, but the police took that as evidence that she would harm her child. And so with that, they continued to push her. She confessed and she was convicted. She ultimately was released in 2013 after the court finally heard evidence from her other child that he had in fact witnessed his little brother strangle himself on accident. And so with that, that's where we're coming from. And moving forward in the Women's Defense Initiative, we are recognizing that our country and our criminal legal system isn't designed to address women's issues, much like it's not designed to address poverty, which we talk about a lot. It's not designed to address racism. And so we want to represent women with claims of actual innocence, as we always have, but we also want to look at the women who may not have the opportunity to be exonerated, but may have the opportunity to be released otherwise, reunited with their families, and rebuild their lives, because there are other issues and violations of rights that are harder to fix, as I mentioned, in the criminal legal system. So one example is Tabitha Pollock. She was a client a while ago of the Center on Wrongful Convictions. She's never been exonerated, however. She was convicted of murdering her 3-year-old daughter, except her boyfriend murdered her daughter, and Tabitha wasn't even present, and that was not disputed at trial. Like, it was well known that her boyfriend had murdered her daughter. But she was essentially convicted of first-degree murder. The prosecutor pushed that she should have known that her boyfriend was a danger to her child. Now, Tabitha, again, quote unquote, lucky. The prosecution used the wrong legal standard to try to have her convicted of murder. And so her conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. But all that would have had to happen for Tabitha to still be in prison is the prosecutor could have charged her with neglect for failing to protect her child instead, or the prosecutor could have just said the correct legal standard instead of the wrong legal standard, and she'd be stuck in prison for something that someone else did. And it's just that easy. And you can see the difference between someone who's exonerated versus someone, or not exonerated, but someone who's released versus someone who's stuck inside if, a different theory of the case is used in a court. Many jurisdictions have laws that prosecute a failure to protect a child. Research has shown those laws are almost exclusively used against women, even though they're facially neutral laws. There are other types of crimes that are pregnancy related or related to postpartum illness. Of course, those crimes are charged against people who can give birth to babies. So generally women. And so our ongoing work is, again, to try to gain release for people like Tabitha Pollock who won't be exonerated, but can maybe get their lives back. Often for these women, moving forward, that will mean asking for mercy through sentencing relief. So just asking to reduce their sentences or asking for mercy from a governor. We just represented a woman who was released from prison last week by the governor of Illinois. She'd been given a 70-year sentence for murdering her child, but she had suffered from long undiagnosed postpartum illness. She had suffered it with each of her children. She had never been screened or diagnosed by her doctors, and it only got worse every time she had a child. Again, going back to looking at crimes and investigating crimes, that the state isn't going to go look for some other explanation for why an action may have happened, and they didn't in this woman's case. Right now, we're representing several women who are victims of domestic violence, and their crimes may have stemmed from that. I'm representing a woman who, much like Tabitha, is serving time for a murder that a significant other who was abusive did. And so that's hard to parse out. It'll be hard for her to show actual innocence, but we're trying to get her released through other methods. We're looking at cases of women convicted of shaking or otherwise abusing children, where there's evidence that falls happened or other accidents happened, and that's been rejected as an idea by the court. And so we're just trying to take a more holistic view at women's issues and give the opportunity for representation to more people who maybe don't have that opportunity right now. And so with that, I'll close by saying this is a good opportunity for us at the Center on Wrongful Convictions to make a mark on the field and to make a broader impact in the criminal legal system. We are hopeful that projects like ours will also open up and look at wrongful convictions a little more broadly over time. And we are excited to be doing this work and excited to talk to you about it and happy to answer any questions.